Hello everyone, hope you're having a beautiful day. Today, we're diving into an emotional story about a man who tried to walk away from love, only to come back with nothing but his courage and a ring made of grass. When everything else is taken away, is love alone enough to stay together? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next videos. James tried to live without Tu Diep. At first, he convinced himself it was the right decision. Letting go, he believed, was the only way to stop the pain from spreading to himself, to her, to everyone caught in between. He told himself that love wasn't enough, that sometimes walking away was the most responsible thing a person could do. So he buried himself in work. His days became tightly packed schedules, back-to-back meetings, endless tasks that left no room to think. He left early, came home late, answered emails at midnight, and filled every empty hour with something that demanded focus. From the outside, it looked like progress. It looked like a man moving forward. But night had a way of undoing everything. When the lights were off and the world finally went quiet, James felt it all collapse. The apartment felt too large, too still. The silence pressed down on him so heavily that even the sound of his own breathing felt intrusive. He ate cold meals alone, standing by the counter because sitting at the table reminded him of what used to be there. He drank coffee with no one across from him, no familiar voice asking if it was too bitter, no shared silence that once felt warm instead of empty. There was no one waiting for him in the evenings, no message asking when he'd be home, no light left on. And slowly, painfully, James was forced to admit a truth he had been running from. He couldn't live without Tu Diep, no matter how busy he stayed, no matter how logical his reasons sounded, no matter how much he told himself this was for the best. His life worked, but it didn't feel alive, and Tu Diep was no different. On her side of the city, life went on in ways that looked almost normal. She still woke up early, still took care of Ly, still smiled when people talked to her, still handled her days with quiet strength. To anyone watching, she looked calm, stable, as if she had accepted everything and moved on. But every morning, her eyes betrayed her. They always drifted to the empty chair at the dining table before she could stop herself. It happened automatically, like muscle memory, as if part of her still expected James to be there, tying his shoes, sipping coffee, listening to her half-finished thoughts. When she cooked, she made one extra portion without thinking. Then she paused. Then she remembered. Old habits didn't disappear just because love ended. They stayed, quiet, persistent, gently reminding her that someone had once been there, someone close, someone real, someone she had loved deeply and without reserve. Tu Diep knew she had chosen sacrifice. She knew why she had done it. She told herself it was necessary, that loving James didn't mean holding on to him at any cost, that sometimes protecting someone meant stepping away. But sacrifice didn't erase pain. Some nights, when Ly was already asleep and the house finally fell silent, Tu Diep hugged her pillow and let the tears come. They soaked into the fabric, warm and relentless. She stared at the ceiling and asked herself the same question again and again. Did their love really have to end this way? She didn't want wealth. She didn't want status. She didn't want a grand future that looked perfect from the outside. All she had ever wanted was James and a small, warm family, a simple life made of ordinary days. That was all. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the street in soft, fading light, James stood outside Tu Diep's gate. He had stood there before, more than once, but never like this. Before, there had always been hesitation, fear, a voice in his head telling him to turn back, to be reasonable, to not make things harder than they already were. This time, There was nothing holding him back. No excuses, no calculations, no retreat. In that quiet moment, James understood something with painful clarity. There were decisions in life that, if not made now, would turn into regrets that lasted forever. He took a breath. Then he knocked. The sound felt louder than it should have. Tu Diep opened the door and froze. For a second, she couldn't move, couldn't speak. She just stood there, staring at him as if he might disappear if she blinked. James looked thinner, more tired. His face carried the weight of sleepless nights and thoughts he couldn't escape. But his eyes were still the same ones she had loved so deeply it once hurt just to look at him. "I'm sorry for coming so suddenly," James said quietly. His voice trembled despite his effort to stay calm. "But if I didn't come today, I'm afraid I'd never find the courage again." Tu Diep didn't answer. Her heart was pounding so hard it almost hurt. Every emotion she thought she had locked away came rushing back at once, leaving her breathless. "I've thought about this a lot," James continued. "I really tried. I tried to live without you." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "And I failed. Every single day felt like I was just existing, like I was doing all the right things, but none of them meant anything." He looked straight into her eyes, not looking away, not hiding. "I don't want a life that's correct, but empty," he said. "I want a life that feels real, and that life, it has you in it." Tears slipped down Tu Diep's cheeks before she could stop them. "James," she whispered, "I don't want you to sacrifice your family, your future, your conscience, not because of me." James shook his head slowly. A faint smile touched his lips, gentle and tired all at once. "You're not a sacrifice," he said. "You're the reason." Before Tu Diep could react, before she could even fully understand what was happening, James lowered himself to one knee. Her breath caught. "James, what are you doing?" she gasped. He reached behind him awkwardly, patting his jacket, then his pants, then froze. His expression changed. There it was. Embarrassment, realization, and something almost see-throughly human. James let out a small laugh and shook his head at himself. "I forgot." "Forgot what?" Tu Diep asked, half crying, half confused. "The ring," James admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I came too fast. I only thought about seeing you, talking to you. I didn't think about anything else." He glanced around and suddenly bent down toward the small patch of grass by the gate. In the soft evening light, he plucked a long blade of grass and carefully twisted it between his fingers, shaping it into a small, uneven circle. His movements were clumsy, slow, but serious. When he looked up, holding out the makeshift ring, his eyes were filled with the tenderness that stole Tu Diep's breath. "Tu Diep," James said, his voice shaking slightly, a quiet smile breaking through. "I know this doesn't look like a proper proposal." He held the grass ring a little tighter. "But right now, this is everything I have." James took a slow breath, steadying himself, as if the weight of everything he was about to say rested on that single moment. He continued, "I can't promise you a wealthy life," he said. "I can't promise the road ahead will be smooth or easy. There will be problems, there will be pressure, there will be days when everything feels too heavy." His voice softened. "But I can promise you this: I will never let you walk alone again." Tu Diep stared at him, tears blurring her vision. The blade of grass in his hand looked fragile, almost laughable, and yet she could feel how serious he was, how real this moment was. James looked at her for a long time, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. "If this love has to stand against the whole world," he said quietly, "then I'm ready." He swallowed. "Will you marry me, even if today the ring is only made of grass?" For a second, Tu Diep didn't respond. Then she broke down, not in loud sobs but in a rush of tears mixed with laughter she couldn't control. She covered her mouth, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "You're unbelievable," she said through her tears. "You really are." James smiled, nervous but hopeful, still kneeling there, still holding out the ring like it was the most precious thing he owned. Tu Diep took a shaky breath and finally spoke. "I've imagined this moment," she said softly, "so many times. I always thought it would be different. A ring, a plan, certainty." She looked down at the grass ring, then back at him. "But somehow, this feels exactly like you." James let out a small laugh, half relief, half disbelief. She nodded. "Yes," Tu Diep said, tears spilling freely now. "I'll say yes." James exhaled like he had been holding his breath for months. He laughed, light, almost boyish, the sound of someone who had just been pulled back from the edge of something dark. "But," Tu Diep added quickly, pointing at him through her tears, "you owe me a real ring." James laughed harder. "I promise," he said, standing up and pulling her into his arms, "the most beautiful one, I swear." "But today," he added softly, holding her close, "all I have is this heart." Tu Diep wrapped her arms around him tightly, pressing her face against his chest. His heartbeat was fast, uneven, but real, solid, alive. In that moment, the fear that had haunted her for weeks began to loosen its grip. Behind them, the door creaked slightly. A small voice drifted out into the quiet evening. "Uncle James?" Both of them froze. Ly stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, half awake, her hair messy from sleep. James looked down at her, his expression softening instantly. "Hey," he said gently, "did we wake you?" Ly looked from James to Tu Diep, then back again, her eyes lingering on their faces, still wet with tears. "Why are you crying?" she asked innocently. Tu Diep knelt down and pulled Ly into her arms. "Happy tears," she said, brushing the child's hair back. "Sometimes when people are very happy, they cry too." Ly thought about this for a moment, then nodded seriously. "Oh," she said, "then that's okay." James laughed quietly. He crouched down beside them and looked at Ly. "I might come around a lot more," he said carefully. "Would that be okay with you?" Ly's eyes widened. "Every day?" she asked. James smiled. "If you'll let me." Ly grinned and wrapped her arms around his neck without hesitation. "Yes," she said confidently, "you can stay." Tu Diep felt her chest tighten, not with pain this time, but with something warm and overwhelming. For the first time in a long while, the picture in her heart felt complete. Later that night, when everything finally settled and Ly had gone back to sleep, James and Tu Diep sat quietly together. No dramatic speeches, no promises shouted into the night. Just silence that felt safe. James reached for her hand. "There's something I need you to understand," he said. "I'm not going abroad." Tu Diep turned to him sharply. "What about your father?" James didn't look away. "I won't run anymore," he said calmly. "Not from him. Not from my life." She hesitated. "He won't accept this," she said. "You know that." "I know," James replied, "but I've spent my whole life living the way he wanted, being who he needed me to be." He squeezed her hand. "And somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be myself." Tu Diep searched his face. "This choice," he continued, "it's not about fighting him. It's about choosing my own life." She swallowed hard. "And if he cuts you off," she asked, "if he takes everything away?" James smiled faintly. "Then I'll start again." The simplicity of his answer stunned her. "I don't need everything," he said. "I just need enough. Enough to live, enough to love, enough to come home to you." Tu Diep leaned her head against his shoulder. For the first time, she didn't try to push him away, didn't try to protect him from his own feelings, didn't try to be the one who sacrificed. She let herself believe. Across town, Mr. Juan sat alone in his study. The house was quiet, too quiet. His phone lay on the desk in front of him, the screen lit up with a single message he had already read more than once. "I'm not leaving, I've chosen my life." Mr. Hone stared at the words, his jaw tight. He had built his life on order, on control, on the belief that discipline and success were the highest forms of love, and yet, for the first time, something slipped beyond his reach. Fear crept in, slow and unfamiliar. Not fear of failure, not fear of loss, but fear of realizing that no matter how much power he held, there were things he could no longer decide. A child's happiness was one of them. Back at Tu Diep's house, James lay awake beside her, listening to the quiet rhythm of the night. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of uncertainty, full of risk, full of love. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring. They didn't know how hard the road ahead might be. But they knew one thing with absolute certainty: they couldn't live without each other. And this time, instead of letting go, they chose to stay together. James tries to live without Tu Diep, convincing himself that letting go is the right choice. He buries himself in work, but loneliness and emptiness follow him every night. Tu Diep appears calm as she cares for Ly, yet her daily habits quietly reveal how deeply she still misses James. Both of them realize that sacrifice doesn't erase love. Unable to keep pretending, James finally returns to Tu Diep's house, choosing courage over fear. With no plan and no ring, he kneels before her and proposes, using a simple ring made of grass, offering only his honesty and his heart. Touched by his sincerity, Tu Diep accepts through tears and laughter. In that moment, they understand that true love isn't about perfection or approval, but about choosing each other, even when the future is uncertain.